Hello and welcome. I'm Valerie Paley, Senior Vice President and Sue Ann Weinberg, Director of the Patricia D. Klingenstein Library at the New York Historical Society. Before we begin, I'd like to thank Louise Mirrer, our President and CEO, Agnes Sue Tang, Chair of the Board of Trustees, and Pam Schaffler, our Chair Emerita, as well as all of our trustees, Joyce B. Cowan, Diane Max, and the late Adam Max, and the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. Along with our Chairman's Council, our members, and our many other generous donors, none of the work of New York Historical would be possible without your committed and continued support. It has been a thrill for me to be recognized as the founding director of our Center for Women's History, the first such center of its kind within the walls of a major museum in the United States. In only a few short years, we've been able to do so much in terms of scholarship, education, programs, collecting, and not least of all, exhibitions, all of which foreground women's critical role in American history. Since 2017, the Joyce B. Cowan Women's History Gallery has been the venue for no fewer than 10 important shows, including our upcoming exhibition, Title IX, Activism on and Off the Field. Which brings me to today's historic panel, a part of the 7th annual Diane and Adam E. Max Conference on Women's History, Title IX at 50, Women's Fight for Access and Equity. The conference, the brainchild of Diane and her late husband, Adam Max, was established in 2016 before the bricks and mortar of our center were even set. We are so grateful to the Maxes for the imagination and impetus to set this cornerstone of our work. We look forward to a full day of panels and conversation next year when the conference, hopefully, will return on site. This year, our format will be a little different as we air our Max Conference programming remotely, spread out over the course of our related exhibition, Title IX, Activism on and Off the Field. And now, I am delighted and honored to introduce today's extraordinary speakers. Alexandra Brodsky is a lawyer and writer. She litigates high-impact cases concerning civil rights abuses in schools and the criminal legal system. Metropolitan Books' Henry Holt recently published her nonfiction debut, Sexual Justice, Supporting Victims, Ensuring Due Process, and Resisting the Conservative Backlash. Alexandra has deep ties to the student movement against sexual harassment. At 23, she co-founded Know Your 9, a youth-led organization combating gender violence in schools. As an attorney at Public Justice, a national public interest legal advocacy group, Alexandra has continued her work on behalf of student survivors of sexual harassment. Prior to joining Public Justice, Alexandra clerked for the Honorable Marcia S. Berzon of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. Atlanta-based author, journalist, and organizer Clarissa Brooks has deep roots corkscrewed into the American South. Raised in Charlotte, North Carolina, Brooks relocated to the Black Mecca of Atlanta, originally to attend Spelman College, later settling in the historic West End neighborhood. Nestled in a historically Black dense with vibrant HBCUs, Brooks fixes a Black queer feminist lens to the vital cultural work she produces for publications like New York Magazine, The Cut, Rolling Stone, and NPR. Her work centers on national and regional history to add crucial context when reporting on historically marginalized and unsupported communities. Naomi Man is the executive director of the Civil Litigation and Justice Program. She is founding director of the Access to Justice Clinic, an innovative clinic which pairs individual client representation with systems change projects. Students there represent individual clients facing multiple systemic barriers in housing, family law, and unemployment cases. Before coming to Boston University, Professor Man worked as a civil rights attorney in the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, where she investigated, mediated, and resolved claims involving educational institution compliance with federal civil rights laws, including Title IX. Our moderator, Irin Carmon, is a senior correspondent at New York Magazine, a CNN contributor, and co-author of Notorious RBG, The Life and Times of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, which spent 3 months on the Times bestseller list and inspired the exhibition New York Historical was proud to mount. She's been a national reporter at MSNBC and NBC News, as well as a staff writer at Salon.com and Jezebel.com, covering gender, reproductive rights, and the law. As a contributing writer to the Washington Post Outlook section, she won a 2018 Mirror Award from the Newhouse School at Syracuse University for her work breaking the story of sexual harassment allegations against Charlie Rose. We are honored to welcome Alexandra, Clarissa, Naomi, and Irin.
Thank you, Valerie. Hello, everybody. I am so pleased to be joined by these distinguished panelists to talk about Title IX and sexual harassment and assault, the activism, the history, where we've been, where we're going. Um, and I want to start by welcoming my panelists. One thing that is so wonderful about the lineup that we have today is that you have all worn several different hats when it comes to the movement to make campuses more equal places for all individuals free from harassment and assault. And you've been activists, you've been journalists, you've been in the federal government, you've been lawyers and practitioners. And so I'm looking forward to talking about all of your different experiences as we understand why it is that we're talking about sexual harassment and assault in a historical conference that commemorates Title IX's anniversary, and where it has fallen short and where we can go from here. I wonder if we could just start out. I know you've heard the formal bios, but given the range of your experiences on this issue, I wonder if each of you could sort of take me through your paths and how it is that you came to understand the importance of Title IX for ensuring a safe learning environment for all. Naomi, why don't we start with you?
Hi, everyone. I'm here. I'm really excited to be part of this webinar and specifically to be part of it with Clarissa and Alexandra, both of whom I know and admire your work and your passion for this subject. So I hope it's okay to start with that. I started working on Title IX and sexual assault issues in law school, and then ended up working at the Victim Rights Law Center, which is a national organization that works on issues regarding sexual assault. And essentially at the time, in the early 2000s, the thinking was that the law really was examining domestic violence and impacts of violence against women in the domestic violence context and not as developed in the sexual assault context. I followed the work at the Victim Rights Law Center with working at the Office for Civil Rights. I was really fortunate to be working for them in the Obama administration, specifically when the Dear Colleague letter came out in 2011. And that really ignited a passion for Title IX work and the critical nature of getting Title IX right. Subsequent to working for the Department of Education, I'm a faculty member, a professor at BU School of Law, where my scholarship focuses very much on Title IX, due process, and this sort of pendulum swing between administrations that I know we're going to get into.
Well, I think this is a great opportunity. I want to ask you a follow-up question that helps anybody who's listening who may not be familiar with what the Dear Colleague letter was. What was the Dear Colleague letter? Why is it important?
So the Dear Colleague letter is a letter that was issued by the Obama administration. And to sort of back up a second, so what happens with these federal statutes that we have in our country is that they're broad, they're big, they're broad. Title IX says we need to have equal access to education based on sex, and the law just cannot cover every eventuality. And so what happens is you have administrative agencies like the Department of Education that basically say, this is what we mean. When we talk about equality for education, this is what we mean. And the Department of Education issues guidance documents. And one of these foundational guidance documents for sexual assault was this 2011 Dear Colleague letter, which very clearly articulated that sexual assault is an important form of sexual harassment that schools must address in order to be in compliance with Title IX. So you'll hear us talk about Dear Colleague letters, also about rulemaking and formal rules. And the important thing to know is that it is essentially different ways that the administrative agencies say to schools, Title IX, the statute doesn't cover every eventuality. Don't worry, we're going to talk about it and we're going to give you a structure to think about it.
And continuing to go in somewhat chronological order, Alexandra, how did you find yourself doing this work?
Yeah, I mean, once again, I just want to say thank you for having me, and I'm excited to be here with this panel. I think that we represent like a couple of different data points in the recent history of Title IX. So I started college in 2008 and had no idea that Title IX had anything to do with sexual harassment. I think I knew vaguely it had something to do with women in sports, but that was it. And that was actually pretty common for college students at the time. But I took a class in the law school on my campus when I was a junior and learned for the first time that Title IX protected survivors of sexual harassment, including sexual assault, and then was invited by some people I worked on a feminist magazine with to join a Title IX complaint against our school to be filed with the Department of Education where Naomi worked. This was an opportunity to invite the federal government to come in and tell our school, this is what you need to do better to ensure that survivors are able to learn in the wake of violence. And that was a really formative experience for me to see what the law could do and how it could be used in conjunction with organizing. So based on my experience with that complaint, with the Department of Education, I connected to students at other schools across the country who were experiencing similar problems. And we started to connect the dots about what was it that students need to know about their rights in order to advocate for themselves. How did we think that the department could be more effective enforcing the law? And that all led to a really exciting wave of student organizing starting, I'd say, around 2013. And I was one of the co-founders of a sort of piece of that wave called Know Your Nine, which was really at the time focused on legal education for students, making sure that, unlike me, students, as soon as they were starting school, knew what their rights were. And I'm proud that Know Your Nine continues to exist today, even though I can no longer credibly call myself a youth activist and I'm not there day to day. But I then went on to law school, and though I'm not speaking in my capacity as an employee, I now work for a nonprofit called Public Justice, and a lot of my docket is race and sex discrimination cases, including a number of sexual harassment cases.
Going back to that moment where you said that you didn't understand what Title IX had to do with sexual harassment and assault. Why was that? Was it that the law was not yet developed? Was it that there had been sort of this fallow period of people not engaging in the law?
I think that is a big question that I will say has ramifications not just for Title IX, but for civil rights in general, which is how do we have these laws that have been on the books for decades, but the people who need them most don't know about it? And so, talking about, let's say, the Dear Colleague letter, one thing that really strikes me is that the Department of Education had been putting out guidance about schools' responsibilities with respect to sexual harassment and also harassment based on race and disability since at least the 90s. And most of the things that were in the Dear Colleague letter, the department had already said multiple times across both Republican and Democratic administrations. But people weren't really paying attention. Schools could bank on their students not knowing their rights and just ignore those obligations. And I think that it was a mix in, around 2011 of the Obama administration using its bully pulpit, starting to increase enforcement efforts, and also students banding together that brought these rights to the fore. So that, when I talk to, I mostly represent high school students now, and I talk to 16-year-olds who know so much more about Title IX than I did at 21. And that to me is really a story of progress, because you have, if a law is working well, people don't actually have to use it, right? It's enough for them to say up front, I know that I have a right to report. I know that my school doesn't have the right, or can't tell me to leave campus. And that, I don't want to be overly sunny about where we find ourselves now, because there has been significant backlash, but I am ultimately heartened that we're in a better place than we were when I started school.
Yeah, I mean, it's such an interesting interplay. And all of your work, I think, has touched on this between, what activists are doing, what institutions, including the federal government, are doing, universities being held accountable, or other institutions of higher learning, all of that kind of coming together to actually move something. So I'm wondering, Clarissa, if you could tell us where your path begins when it comes to these topics and issues.
Yeah, I feel kind of like a third generation of all of these, just various moments in time. So I'm Clarissa. I am a journalist and an organizer. very similarly, age is catching up to me. And I'm like, I also can no longer call myself a youth organizer, but I still try to keep that energy. And yeah, so
What's
I
the
actually,
cutoff, do you think? Sorry to interrupt, but I'm just
I'm pretty
curious
sure
what
it's
the
like,
cutoff
I'm
is.
pretty sure it's like 24.
Okay.
I'm pretty sure it's 24. Well, like some organizations, they'll push it, but for Know Your Nine, I'm pretty sure I'm past that. But I joined this lovely movement as a student organizer at Spelman. So Spelman is a all-women's college and an HBCU in Atlanta, Georgia. And I went there 2014 to 2018. And I think the blessing is that even as we follow the timeline of really crucial Title IX movement work, I show up in that space where 2014, 2015, Trayvon Martin's case was happening, Black Lives Matter started, and also there was a huge push for students on campus to really be talking about sexual violence at HBCUs. And so I joined a student organization on campus and also thankfully met Kayla Haynes, who was a part of Know Your Nine and really kind of, I'd say, ushered me into Know Your Nine and the sexual violence movement as a whole. And I really, cut my teeth in learning about policy, learning about how it affects students, and also specifically understanding how and why it affects HBCU students and Black survivors very differently, because the ways that Alexandra and Naomi are talking about the policy show up very differently for institutions with different formations.
Could you elaborate on that? How do they show up differently?
Yeah, so with Title IX, there's specific policies around jurisdiction and sexual violence on campus. And with a lot of HBCUs, especially with parties, when it comes to fraternities and sororities, with the big PWIs, they're on campus, and most fraternities and sororities at HBCUs are off campus. So most times we're talking to students who have to go directly to APD, and APD has its own history and legacy of sexual violence misconduct. So yeah, we're just dealing with a different set of conditions when it comes to survivors are like, I can go through with the case against my school because my assault happened on campus, whereas a lot of survivors who are interacting with parties off campus have to go a different route, and also have to, also because Spelman and Morehouse are next door to each other, there's also just different ways that jurisdiction happens with schools that are co-located as well.
You mentioned you're also a journalist. I'm curious how your activism and your journalism work together or are separate.
Yeah, I think this is like probably where the lines blur. And I think I've like Sage and all the people I know, I know this, but I was doing student organizing work and I was just like, nobody's reporting on this, so I'm just going to start pitching it. And so that's actually how I was already writing and was already training to be a journalist when I was at school. But specifically, there were actions happening and I literally just pitched Allison Mahoney, who was the political editor at Teen Vogue at the time. And I do credit her with like politically changing Teen Vogue as well. Yeah, she just took my pitch. And I think the beauty of that op-ed that I wrote about HBCUs is that it still reverberates. I get students and faculty telling me that they're teaching it in their classes still, and I wrote that in 2017.
Do you mind taking us through it? I've read it, but everyone watching may not have read it.
Yeah. So there was an action at Spelman and Morehouse where students plastered the names of known perpetrators on campus on the sidewalks one morning. And so what led was like, I'd probably say like 3 different days of actions. A student also spray painted the Morehouse Martin Luther King Chapel. It was a wild time, but all of that to say, it was a deep reflection of one, how HBCUs are defunded when it comes to their Title IX offices. There's a huge legacy of Title IX officers coming in and out, of cases being neglected, of no contact orders not being taken seriously, especially because the schools are so co-located. And also just like there's the interplaying of like Black culture and HBCUs are just really complicated to understand when it comes to power and systems. And so because of that, we were just fighting a different fight. And also we were in the beautiful time of DeVos. who was also making our life very difficult as student organizers. So we were fighting locally at our schools to protect survivors. Like, I'm talking about like, I'd say we were the first line of defense for survivors, being like, my perpetrators in Lower Manly. What do I do? Because they didn't have any trust in the Title IX office. And we were also writing op-eds, training students across the country, and learning about policy ourselves, really as babies, trying to fight against, I'd probably say, one of the most conservative Title IX Department of Education that we've ever had.
So you talked about being at college between 2014 and 2018. So your time there straddled the Obama administration and the Trump administration, this enormous sea change. And I want to get into that backlash, but I just want to very briefly, if any of you want to jump in, you talked about this kind of resurgence of activism, which manifested in different ways in different places, but was this interplay between what the Obama administration was doing, what student activists were doing in their different capacities. Just briefly before we move on to backlash, what positive changes or what new understandings happened during that time? Any of you who want to jump in? What did we learn? What was accomplished?
I can go briefly. And I think it's actually more internal than anything else. I really enjoy the fact that Title IX offices across the country are really scared of students. I really enjoy that they feel like they have someone to answer to. Like, students are really like they're showing up to campus like, I know what Title IX is, or they're being trained about it, or their friends are. I mean, I feel like when I was a student, it was getting to the point where students were like, we are building systems to keep each other safe, because they were not trusting the schools to do that. Like, not just like bystander trainings, like truly getting people safely to their dorms, handling conflict within their friend groups. When I speak to students now, they're asking me about restorative justice and transformative justice, because they're at that point where they're like, we know the Title IX process is not safe for us, and we need immediate steps to keep our friends safe. And so I think for me, I feel really proud that students are, as Alex said, like just truly politically much sharper than they've ever been. And they have a very clear political line that I'm very proud to have been a part of.
I mean, as someone who attended college between 2001 and 2005, which is ancient in Title IX terms, I mean, just calling myself a feminist got me, harassed, bullied, the backlash on a supposedly liberal campus. So it's just incredible to see how the individuals that followed just did not take the status quo for granted. There's such a difference just in a couple of years. Alex, Naomi, do you guys want to jump in terms of what was accomplished before we talk about what was eroded?
Sure. Go ahead, Alex, if you want first. Yeah.
Sure. I mean, I think it is really hard to overstate how much concrete progress we saw over a very short period of time. So to put this in perspective, when I was part of this complaint against my college in 2011, we did not have a publicly identified Title IX coordinator. I did not know, I knew many students who've been sexually assaulted. I think I knew one who had ever gone through any kind of meaningful investigation. There were like 17 different boards across the university, each one of which had different powers such that students never knew who to report to. And I think most importantly, the school was not meaningfully offering support services to survivors. So, I think that there are a lot of seemingly small things that a school can do that will make a big difference for survivors' ability to stay in school. So I'm talking about providing mental health care, allowing someone to change dorms, because even if someone doesn't want to go through a disciplinary hearing, they might just not want to share a dorm with the person who has been sexually harassing them. People might have missed a bunch of class because, in immediate aftermath of an assault, and they need a tutor to help them catch up on what they missed. And if they don't get those things, they might leave campus, they might fall behind in their coursework. Generally, they might lose scholarships if their GPAs plummet. And these are now really, I think, the bread and butter of school responses to gender violence, and we're just not available to victims, at least not in any kind of meaningful, transparent way when I was in school. And that those are real victories, and I think we should claim those real victories.
Naomi?
Yeah, I love the concept of sort of claiming those victories. And, you know, as Clarissa and Alex have mentioned, I mean, there wasn't a structure. I mean, there were these laws on the books, but there just wasn't a structure. And, you know, there's a lot of people asking kind of what is going to make Title IX really work in the future. And there's no question that having the department sort of step in and sort of say, we're going to take this seriously, this is what we're going to look at, made a difference in schools. And to Clarissa's excellent point about kind of, you know, schools can be reactive to students, right? If the students are coming in and they're engaged and they know that they have these rights and the schools know that the Department of Education is going to enforce them, then it really can provide an enormous change from kind of actually having a structure, because many schools didn't actually have a structure, didn't have a Title IX coordinator, weren't tracking trends on campus, weren't studying what was happening. And this is all hugely problematic in the context of a law that says to schools, you are responsible for ensuring an equal access to education. And there were so many steps that weren't happening. And so part of it is the Department of Education sort of saying, we're going to take this seriously. And a really big part of it, which isn't fair, but is true, is the student activists who really took it upon themselves to say, we're going to work to change the system. We're going to work to educate ourselves.
So all three of you have sketched out this blossoming of activism and of institutions finally listening, being responsive, not just when it comes to Title IX sexual assault and harassment, but also when it came to Black Lives Matter. So we're thinking about the middle of the 2010s. And just as certain as you have resurgence of activism and new understandings, you have backlash to all of the above. And Clarissa, you alluded to this. In 2016, of course, Donald Trump gets elected on the strength of implicitly and explicitly arguing that these movements have gone too far, that they have marginalized white men. Of course, he himself being accused repeatedly of harassment and assault, and puts into place an infrastructure that is, I think, directly responsive to the gains that you've all described, directly aimed at rolling them back, let's say. And this is something you all witnessed from the front lines. So anybody who wants to jump in, for folks who may not be intimately familiar with what Betsy DeVos did during her time running the Department of Education, how did that change the game when it came to Title IX enforcement? Maybe Naomi, let's start with you since you worked inside the government.
Right. So I worked inside the government during the Obama administration, and then I left sort of before the transition happened, and before we even knew there was what the transition was going to look like. Essentially, sorry, I'm like blanking for a second, but it doesn't matter because
just tell me what Betsy DeVos did.
Yeah, I know. Sorry. Right.
Okay.
So
I want to assume that anybody watching knows all of the regulatory and the ins and outs.
Yeah. So, right. So one of the first actions regarding education that was taken, of course, is to appoint Betsy DeVos as Secretary of Education. And the folks who worked in the Betsy DeVos DOE were very clear about their opinions about sexual assault. In fact, Betsy DeVos herself early on said, you know, I'm concerned about this crisis of sexual assault in our schools of men being unfairly accused of sexual assault. And you had Candace Jackson saying that, you know, most cases of sexual assault on college campuses sort of involve a young woman getting drunk and then regretting that she had slept with a young man. And I'm using that binary very deliberately, and sort of regretting it. And that what we need to do is to sort of really erect a structure that takes into account the fact that there are many people being falsely accused of sexual assault, and what's being called sexual assault in and of itself is getting way too big. And so what the administration did is through an administrative process called rulemaking, they made a new rule. And the new rule is binding on educational institutions in the United States. that receive any form of public funding. So basically pretty much every K through 12 and post-secondary institution in the United States. And what the rule did sort of in response is to take this sort of pendulum of kind of was swinging a little gently in terms of where the rights are focused and to swing it wildly in the other direction as a backlash. So starting with the assumption that there are a lot of false accusations about sexual assault, the Trump administration widely embraced this model of saying, well, since sexual assault is potentially criminally prosecutable, the best thing and the fairest thing that we can do for someone accused of sexual assault is to basically create this quasi-criminal court system within the schools. This has been called sort of turning classrooms into courtrooms. That's the title of my most recent article kind of on this, and sort of really fundamentally shifting what the school's role is in terms of equity and what the school's role is in terms of their students. And the Trump administration, in addition, sort of in the zeal to kind of make it harder for people to bring cases, one of the fundamental changes that they made is they brought Title IX enforcement when it comes to sexual assault out of line with other forms of discrimination. So for example, if you are a woman of color who is being sexually harassed and you believe that the harassment is based on race and it's also based on sex, under Title VI, you would have to say that the harassment is severe, persistent, or pervasive. Title IX standard used to be that. It's not that anymore. It has to be severe, pervasive, and additional requirements are being placed. And so the Trump administration sort of drew Title IX far, far away from sort of where the norms for enforcement are.
I just want to note the hypocrisy or the irony of kind of the rhetoric of Blue Lives Matter, of, all defendants or all criminally accused people are automatically guilty, could even just get the death penalty for whatever interaction, pick your facts. We're at the same time summoning these arguments about due process for individuals who are accused of assault that are extraordinarily high and not consistent when it comes to just yelling, beat up this person at a rally, or always taking the side of law enforcement. Clarissa, you talked before about experiencing being an organizer on campus before and after these changes. Tell us more about what that meant in a practical sense for the work that you were doing.
Yeah, I think I actually remember the day after the election, myself and other organizers actually met on campus with students to talk about the shift. And it was like, I'd probably say one of the darkest days in college, just because like as Black students, we understood that this was a pushback to right-wing conservatism that was gonna directly affect not just survivors, but Black folks in general. And so sitting with that was pretty intense. And then I think thinking about DeVos's time in the DOE and thinking about I think before DeVos got there, we were fighting Obama and his administration to fight for even the most basic of things. But then I think DeVos's time really made us, and I think it's like a running joke that we say, but DeVos really put our nervous systems through it. Because we were always worried about rule changes. We were worried about any legal shifts that could affect survivors. So we're training students on what Title IX is, as we're also keeping an eye out on any changes that her team is doing. And it was a constant back and forth because we didn't know when it was happening. We didn't know, even the time of the rule change, I'd say at Know Your Nine, we were all hands on deck for probably 4 months, just waiting for the document to drop, waiting to figure out how we have to change our trainings, how we have to change how we're talking about it, especially when it came to the cross-examination piece. I think that was the most brutal part of that rule. That was really difficult to talk to survivors about, where you have to tell somebody, this person now has the legal right to question what happened to you in front of people. And And yeah, I think it was just difficult as survivors and also as folks training survivors and student organizers around this rule, because it emotionally was really taxing. And also I think the legality of it made it feel like kind of a constant gaslighting, having to be like, we have to keep proving that these things happened. We have to keep proving that the things that happen to us are not okay and that they should not continue, to a world that keeps saying that it doesn't care.
You know, in the years leading up to the Betsy DeVos rule change, there was a backlash happening. You might call it on the center right, the center left. That you know, a mix of like reporters and commentators saying already that there had been overreach when it came to Title IX. And interestingly, a lot of times this critique was couched in the form of concern for Black men being falsely accused or being disproportionately targeted for allegations, and drawing on both historical and present concerns about Black men being disproportionately targeted for being accused of these kinds of offenses. So, Clarissa, I'm curious how you felt about the Trump administration then kind of deploying that. You know, I mean, saying, hey, it's because we're so worried about all of the Black men being falsely accused, given those existing and historic sensitivities.
Yeah, I think it actually says something more about media as a tool of white supremacy, and specifically the ways that identity politics, even as we understand it through the Combahee River Collective, has been taken, mismanaged, and turned into a means to regulate identity as a means of like hierarchy, right? So I think for me, that time was interesting. I'm thinking specifically about the New York Times or maybe Washington Post. I'm forgetting her name, but there was an op-ed writer at either one of those publications who was writing these pieces about Black men and Title IX.
There were a few, right? Judith Shulevitz was one of them. Emily
Yeah.
Yoffe.
Oh my
Judith
good.
Shulevitz was writing in the Times. Emily Yoffe in the
Sarah
Atlantic.
Bazelon, yeah.
Oh my gosh, they had
Sarah
them
Bazelon in the
full.
Times too.
I mean, just
White
full
women.
time. Yeah, all white women, all writing about this every single week. I think there was a point where Sage was like, I'm just gonna stop sending you these because they're not fun to read. But I think it was interesting just because the beautiful thing about how the right uses identity politics is it's always hollow. It never actually does what it says it's doing, and there's never any follow through. We see this very similarly when the right goes against reproductive justice. It's hollow. And there's never any follow through on like, you're using these marginalized people to support a policy that you actually want to criminalize women for. Because I think the thing I feel the most about that time was that the core of it is always a very Christian, anti-woman sentiment around women being inherently evil and wrong, and that sexual violence being something that is inherently a woman's fault. And it always shows through the rhetoric and through the language. So I think that time was difficult, especially being an HBCU organizer, because yeah, there is a comms narrative that works, that gets to Black folks, that we have to be like, the core of this is not actually what it's saying it is. And having to get through that with students was important. And also talking to students just about their lived reality felt really important. So I think a lot of the rhetoric in that time in media was difficult, but I think it also taught me a lot as a journalist about what it means to train survivors to write about their experiences and to make sure we're actually training organizers to write, because the right, they're gonna have their writers. So I think that's been my calling since then, is to really train organizers to write about their stories so that we're written in the record.
That's a really interesting way that your two hats kind of come together. Alexandra, in your book, you wrote about how to understand what about due process as a rejoinder. You know, when is it a good faith concern? Because of course, you know, Clarissa, you talk about how cynically these histories and presents are being deployed, but they are based on real concerns in the world, real sort of abdications of due process that some people have experienced, especially Black people have experienced much more. So it's easy to say, you know, these are a bunch of right-wing hacks, because many of them are, but are there legitimate concerns about due process when it comes to changing these systems to try to get justice for survivors. We talked about the pendulum swing. How do you answer good faith critiques that say we've gone too far, the pendulum has swung too far?
I think that this is so tough, and it's so tough that I spent a couple years writing a book about it, that this what about due process has become really a dog whistle for a lot of the right, but that doesn't mean that we can dismiss all the concerns out of turn. I think that would be a betrayal of the same values that bring us to care about survivors, about access to education, about equality, about everyone being treated with dignity. And so, I think part of the project is to listen to what seem like they might be good faith concerns, and to figure out what a better path forward would be. And I think that's I don't think we have to approach that as feminists from a position of defensiveness, in significant part because where schools have mistreated people accused of any kinds of harms, including sexual harassment, that's not Title IX's fault. There's nothing about Title IX that says you need to railroad people accused of sexual violence. I think that it is true that there are some schools, as they were rushing to come into compliance with a law that they had been ignoring for decades, adopted some sloppy procedures that hurt survivors and sometimes hurt people accused. I don't think necessarily to the degree that these the writers that Clarissa was mentioning would have us believe, but I do think that happens sometimes. And I think that we can, from a position of openness, say, okay, let's look at what wasn't working there. Let's look at what could be improved. But one thing that I think is really important about how we approach that question is that we not single out sexual harassment for different treatment. So one thing that was really frustrating for me to see in a lot of the sort of non-lawyer talking head debate around these issues is that people would have objections to how, let's say, a school had investigated a sexual assault allegation, where their concerns were really just concerns about student discipline in general. So to give you an example, in most of the country, the vast majority of students have no right to sort of the kind of cross-examination that we see in a courtroom, where someone stands up or their lawyer stands up and directly and aggressively questions a witness or the person who's accused them. And that's not something specific to sexual harassment. That's for students who've been accused of any kind of serious misconduct that might result in a suspension or expulsion. And we can have a debate about whether that's good or not, what kinds of hearing models we want schools to use. But what we instead had was critics coming in and saying Title IX bans schools from providing students rights as though they had those rights in other disciplinary proceedings. And so, my response to that is, yeah, I agree that a lot of student discipline at all levels of education is unfair. In addition to my cases concerning harassment, I also do a lot of cases concerning discriminatory discipline, including against survivors. And so these are real problems. So let's have that conversation. Let's have a conversation about improving student discipline in general and not do what DeVos did, which is come in and say, we're going to make a uniquely onerous process for vetting allegations of sexual violence that's uniquely likely to re-traumatize. Let's import all of these restrictions on what schools can do. Let's narrow the definition of sexual harassment, all of that, in a way that only hurts survivors and leaves most students mistreated through student discipline without a remedy. And I think that, just one really concrete illustration of that hypocrisy is that at the very same time that DeVos's Department of Education was going through this process to put out new Title IX regulations, it rescinded a really key guidance document from the Obama administration that was meant to reduce racial disparities in student discipline. And you had the same people going out there and saying, we need to strip survivors of their rights in order to protect Black men, as though Black survivors don't exist, saying in every other context, when Black children are over-disciplined, it's because they're bad. That was the DeVos line. It's that racial disparities in discipline reflected real differences in behavior and not what is true, which is it reflects the racism of educators.
Thank you. Now, Naomi, I know I gave you kind of the expository role. I'm just curious if there's anything you want to add about the what about due process and backlash, because I know you've written about it.
Yeah, so yeah, in terms of the due process distortion, which is really what it is, right? It's sort of taking constitutional due process and really distorting it kind of for your own ends, right? It found a home in the DeVos administration, but it's a concept that's been around for a really long time. This concept of rape exceptionalism, this idea from our criminal law from a long time ago, which is essentially that, there were additional criteria that those who alleged sexual assault had to meet in order to be believed. You weren't thought of as credible when you allege sexual assault. And of course, that was as strong as saying, and there are cases and case law that essentially says that Black women were not able to be raped, right? That even if there was a sexual assault, it was something that was not criminally punishable. And so the burdens of this rape exceptionalism and this idea that we can't credit people who come forward and allege sexual assault has fallen disproportionately on individuals based on axes of identity. And the DeVos DOE is saying, well, we really care, right, about the fact that potentially there's sort of disproportionate impacts, right, on men of color who are accused of sexual assault. And what we're seeing is, and while we know that this definitely happens in this racist world that we live in, what we're seeing is, so let's just act as if we're going to be in the criminal system. And what we know about the criminal system, of course, is that it is in fact itself deeply racist. And so you're substituting sort of one system that has allegations of racism connected to it, right, and produces these results that are racist, sort of being overlaid on top of a system supposedly to protect. And as both Clarissa and Alexandra have brought up, what about women of color? Camilla Willingham wrote an incredibly poignant letter regarding Harvard. So what happened to her at Harvard, where she sort of says, in this rush to protect men of color who are being accused of sexual assault, everyone protecting, and it's an important protection to have, is pretending that sort of is erasing the women of color who are the victims here as well. And of course, Kimberly Crenshaw has talked about how when it comes to sexism, white women get foregrounded, and when it comes to racism, men of color will get foregrounded. And so there's a real gap there as well. And the actions of the administration do not at all comport with sort of what their stated goal is, which is to reduce discrimination, because they're just importing a criminal model into the schools, and there wasn't anything about, and let's make sure it's not enforced in a discriminatory manner.
Yeah, I always think that Professor Anita Hill had a very clear distillation of that concept, where she talked about with Clarence Thomas, he had a race and I had a gender. Mm-hmm. I want to spend the balance of our time talking about where we are now and where we might go when it comes to everything that we've been talking about. I understand we're in a kind of unsettled place when it comes to the Biden administration. Mercifully for advocates of equality in 2020, Trump was defeated. We're about a year and change into a new administration. What do we know about how they might change things or already have? I know that there's regulatory processes that can slow this down, but any of you want to jump in and explain to me, as it stands, as we speak, what's happening?
So the best information that we have is that the Department of Education will release what's called a notice of proposed rulemaking next month. And what that basically means is they'll put out this massive document that says, here's what we would like to change about the Title IX's regulations, and give the public an opportunity to comment on that, which is both, I would say it is both good to get public input, and also this is the process that the Biden administration is required to go through because the Trump administration went through an analogous process in creating the regulations. So I really understand the frustration from students that the Biden administration didn't come in on day one and toss out the Trump regs. I also wish that the administration had acted more quickly, but unfortunately there are all of these regulatory rules that are going to slow down this process. One thing that really excites me about these regulations is that our best understanding is that they're not just going to be about sexual harassment, but are also going to include protections for LGBTQ students, potentially for pregnant and parenting students. And that is good for students writ large. And I also think it's helpful for us to remember that at the end of the day, Title IX is a civil rights law, right? This is not a law, as it is sometimes discussed, that is asking schools to be little courtrooms to replicate criminal law on their campuses. And so I think keeping all of these different issues in conversation with each other, in each other's context, it will be better for our conversation going forward.
Does that mean that for the last year or so, survivors have been dealing with a Biden administration in the White House, but the rules of Betsy DeVos?
Yes, that's right. And I mean, what I will say, this goes to the distinction between guidance and rulemaking that Naomi had talked about earlier, where these guidance documents are a really fast way for an administration to say, this is how we view a civil rights law that we have the job of enforcing. Regulations take longer to put in place, but then they have staying power. And so that's frustrating this moment. I will say that it is good. It will be good news if we have President Tom Cotton and he wants to roll back Biden regulations, that it will be harder for him to do that than if the Biden administration were simply replacing regulations with more non-binding guidance.
Oof, God help us all. I'm wondering if any folks would like to jump in and talk about what you'd like to see from the Biden administration and beyond. Alexandra talked a little bit about the expansions of understandings of how to use Title IX. What do you hope will come out, and what kinds of comments do you expect to have about these shifts?
Yeah, I was going to jump in. I think from the student experience, I think the thing that has been the most jarring for Title IX has been the pandemic. It has, I'd say, deeply slowed down a lot of cases, stalled a lot of cases that are going into negligence. And I think the other thing that I've been seeing with students and that I'm noticing specifically for HBCU students is a lot of HBCUs, specifically Howard, schools that have, I'm forgetting the name of the website. There was a website that kept track of all the schools that were negligent of Title IX. I don't think that website exists anymore, but schools have a playbook for how to kill student movements. And I think that's been the most jarring to see within the past year and a half with the pandemic on top of it, is students are really trying their best to fight for just more equitable campuses, and schools will drop an NDA and it quiets things pretty quickly. So I think for students, they're trying to reorganize and find ways to build power as they're coming out of the pandemic. There are students who were freshmen when they got to their schools and they're now juniors. And they're really having to adjust to what Title IX even means for them in person. And also realizing that I feel like there is a conservative push happening with higher education institutions and how they're handling student movements. That's been pretty jarring to see. I'd say politically, but I also put my faith.
And I just want to stop to clarify for a second. So when you say that the pandemic, simultaneously there have been these delays, is it the case that the universities are using the pandemic as an excuse to delay these proceedings in some cases?
Yeah, I think what we're seeing from survivors is folks being like, I haven't gotten any update on my case because of the pandemic, because schools are truly in the midst of everything like the rest of us, trying to adjust to what that even means for their departments. But now that things are coming back in person, they're trying to get updates and not hearing anything back. And so what does it look like to hold those schools accountable for keeping up to date on that? Also, as students are coming back to campus and dealing with perpetrators being in person again, how are they keeping their contact orders has been a real tough battle for folks to climb. Even I think at Spelman, Clark, Morehouse, and even Howard, there was a huge housing crisis. And so a lot of students are like, I don't have my basic needs met. let alone trying to fight against sexual violence on campus. So a lot of it is really getting to those things before they can do that. But a lot of schools are really kind of chopping those movements before they can start.
Well, I think that's such an important point, that you could have this kind of backlash regardless of who's in the White House, right? Regardless of the stated politics of the individuals who are making these decisions and in positions of power. The color of the flag of the White House or whatever has shifted, but these kinds of backlashes, it sounds like, are still being manifested. Naomi, I'm curious how you see this moment.
Yeah, I see this moment as one in which hopefully sort of this wild swinging back and forth of rights and responsibilities of schools is going to quiet a little bit with hopefully the Biden administration. Now we're going through rulemaking. So as Alexandra pointed out, it will be at least more stable, even if it's sort of overturned in a next administration or at some point in the future. I think that there's a lot of promise right now schools fundamentally are educational institutions, and for a school to, or should be, right? And so for a school to study, if schools were to take this problem seriously and study it, I believe that schools could be sources of great creativity and great movement and momentum towards really fully implementing Title IX. There isn't a reason that schools have to replicate our legal system, right? And the Trump administration's rule has really thrown into sharp relief how much we rely on kind of law and legal courtroom norms as yardsticks for fairness. And so really what we can do is to say, and I've talked about this with students, and I'm currently trying to work this through, what would it look like if a school, instead of siloing everything, just said, student, if you feel you're being discriminated against, you can have one system. And instead of saying, I feel like I was discriminated against on the basis of disability and sex, right now you have to go to 2 different places. And if you have another marginalized identity, you have to go to 3 different places, right? So to make a Title VI and a Title IX claim, for example, in a school, or an American with Disabilities Act and a Title IX claim in a school, hopefully my vision for Title IX and my vision for schools is that we would start thinking about this much more holistically, and to sort of say, if we care about identity, if we care about discrimination, and if we care about equity, then rather than saying just to students, just parcel up your identities into these different packages and put one piece over here and one piece over there, we would just take the student who comes in and say, okay, Title IX means that you should be treated equitably in your institution, regardless of what your other identities are, and maybe even specifically in looking at what your other identities are. Because for now, Title IX has tended to protect individuals. The fewer marginalized identities you have, the greater protection you're often getting from Title IX. And that just quite simply isn't equitable. So that's my vision for the future of Title IX. Time will tell.
Naomi, I'm realizing that I missed the opportunity, but we still have a couple of minutes to ask you a question from the vantage point of being an academic, being part of these institutions. And I'm wondering if you agree with Clarissa that there has been this kind of internalized backlash among administrators of these institutions that could outlast whoever is president.
Absolutely. I think that there's no question that, and I honor the work that Clarissa has done and Alex did as students, because there's definitely a sort of David versus Goliath feeling, I think, when you're a student and you have administrators who've been in their positions for a long period of time. In my own institution, we're actively grappling with these issues, and I see an enormous amount of goodwill on the part of the administrators. That's all to say, some schools have a lot of independence. You could have a school where people are trying to do the right thing, and you could just as easily have a school where people may not know how to do the right thing, or even may be motivated specifically to say, I'm not going to do the right thing because I just want this to not be a public relations disaster. And what we know about sexual assault too, is that there are very high dropout rates after a sexual assault if the student doesn't feel or think that that the school has taken it seriously. And so sometimes, unfortunately, I think it does become a business decision for the school. And the job of lawyers, OCR, student activists is to really be sure that it is not the better business decision to basically try to squash student movements or kind of hope that a Title IX problem goes away.
Thank you. We have 5 minutes left, so I want to open up sort of a lightning round to say, what did we not talk about that you want to leave our viewers with when it comes to these questions? And anybody can feel free to jump in if there's something at the tip of your tongue.
I will say that I think a huge part of student experience right now that the law has to be more responsive to is retaliation against survivors who come forward. Rightfully, there's a lot of discussion about sort of investigation processes, but there's a lot more to Title IX than that. And a huge part of it is that many students who come forward end up being disciplined themselves, sometimes because they were drinking at the time that they were assaulted, and so the school punishes them for drinking against school rules, or sometimes for quote unquote having sex on school grounds when the sex in question is the assault that they reported. And I think that, I believe that that's illegal already, but I don't think that schools believe that that's illegal right now. And so I think that the department needs to be really clear about that, and that also incorporating that into our understanding of the obstacles that survivors face, I think gives us a fuller story of the challenges and scrambles a little bit the conversations we've been having that sort of put fair disciplinary procedures and rights for survivors in opposition to one another.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think I'll add in that maybe twofold. I think the way that the rules and schools specifically handle queer and trans survivors, I feel like I would say has been a shit show, kindly. It's just one, really complicated, and also I think what's been difficult is we're running into administrators that politically are not there. And so having to explain to administrators folks' identity as they're also trying to work through the policy and the legal part, it's just distressing because it really invalidates survivors. They're already vulnerable and scared, and having to explain to an administrator what non-binary means and how it affects the rule and how it affects their ability to be safe and why their perpetrator living down the hall from them makes them unsafe. It's a lot of hurdles that don't benefit anybody. And yeah, it's a lot to put on survivors. I'd probably say secondly, that the way that the rule handles the internet and social media is really not where it needs to be. I think that point about retaliation showed up a lot when it comes to Twitter, when it comes to Instagram, and how when survivors don't feel heard, their go-to is to be like, I need to tell somebody that this happened, as their last step to feel safe and to protect other people, and then they can have Title IX cases put against them. So I think we could find a way.
They can be retaliated against just for reporting, you're saying?
Yeah. Or just posting online, just being like,
posting online, not
Mm-hmm.
formally going through the process of reporting, but just telling their story. Yeah, that's such an important point as we think about how to move forward. Naomi?
Yeah, and I'm building off of both of those excellent points. They just sort of throw into relief too, right? That the law can only do so much and the rules can only do so much, right? So, there's a recent Supreme Court case in Title VII basically saying that sex should be read as gender, which potentially should cover the situation that Clarissa was talking about, which should cover the situation that Clarissa was talking about in terms of administrators understanding that discrimination based on sex includes gender identity, includes sexual orientation. But if the actual people implementing the rule and in the school and creating the culture sort of aren't there yet, then the law can sort of say what it says, but the change isn't really going to happen. And so it's really a situation and a longstanding problem where we need good laws and we need OCR making sort of good rules. And we also need to not have student movements being squashed and to have voices being elevated so that we can really change culture around sexual assault.
I want to thank all three of you. I am not a newbie to these issues, and yet I feel like I've learned so much about where we've been, where we are going, hopefully. So thank you to each of you for your time, your wisdoms, your insights, and amazingly, thank you for having the remarkable discipline to stay on time, even though I feel like just based on the lightning round, we could have 10 more panels based on the ideas that you just threw out there casually. So I hope we can continue the conversation. And in the meantime, thank you so much.
No, thank you.
We have unfortunately run out of time. I want to thank Alexandra Brodsky, Clarissa Brooks, Naomi Man, and Irin Carmon for being with us today. Our Max Conference series, Title IX at 50, Women's Fight for Access and Equity, will continue throughout the spring and beyond. Please sign up for our mailing list and follow us at nyhistory.org to get the latest on the series. Finally, the New York Historical Society is currently open on Wednesday through Sunday. You can reserve your timed entry museum tickets on our website. We hope to see you on Central Park West to view Title IX, Activism on and Off the Field, opening May 13th in our Joyce B. Cowan Women's History Gallery. Thank you again.